Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to talk about Kuki Shinobu, an electro healer character who got much better with the release of the Dendro element, as she has a very strong role in these Dendro teams as a 2-in-1 electro applier who will proc powerful reactions such as Hyperbloom and also a healer for your whole team. Because of that, this video is going to go over why Kuki Shinobu is actually good right now, why I think you should build her, and then go into everything you need to know regarding how to build this character, her best artifacts, weapons, teams, and just every aspect of her kit and build so that you can get the most value out of this character. Before we begin, I do want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and I don't want to waste any of your time, so let's get right into the video. Alright, so starting things off, we're going to talk about Kuki Shinobu's abilities and talents, give you a brief breakdown on what her kit does, then move into her two playstyles that this video is going to be split into, talking about the different ways that you can actually build and play her, and then move on to why she's actually good now and why I believe you should be building her, especially due to her role in the new Dendro reaction-based team comps. So starting things off, the first part of her kit is actually going to be her elemental skill. This ability will drain a bit of your Kuki's HP to place an electro ring around you. This ring will follow your active character, so it'll stay on you even if you switch out of Kuki, and it will deal a bit of electro damage to nearby opponents, which scales on your attack, while also healing your active character based on your Kuki Shinobu's max HP. Now, I will say the damage of this ability usually isn't that high unless you're building specifically for Aggravate, as if not, you'd rather build Elemental Mastery or HP, but more on that a bit later. What is nice, however, is that number one, it'll passively heal your character, so Kuki can be the healer role in your team, but it will also apply electro relatively rapidly and consistently from off field to everything around you. Because of that, you can proc very valuable reactions such as Hyperbloom by applying electro to the Dendro cores around you, or by just hitting enemies with electro if that's something that you need in your team comp. And so because of that, your elemental skill will help for electro application while also healing your team as a nice 2-in-1. Also, something to note about this ability is that it lasts for 12 seconds with a 15-second cooldown, which means you'll only have 3 seconds of downtime, and this is at C0. If you do have your second constellation, which we'll talk more about later, you actually have 100% uptime. It'll last for 15 seconds with 15-second cooldown, which makes it just really good uptime wise. Even at C0, having it out for 12 seconds, constantly applying electro and healing you from off field is already very good, and then with your second constellation, it gets even better, and this is going to be the central part of your kit. While yes, sometimes you're going to be using Kuki for her burst as well, some playstyles revolve around just using her skill, since this is constantly going to apply electro to enemies, allowing you to proc valuable reactions, and also, as I said, heal your team. Another thing to note though is that while your damage scales on attack and your healing scales on HP, you actually gain bonus scalings based on your elemental mastery to both your damage of your skill and also your healing. On top of just that, you do even heal an extra amount when your Kuki is under 50% HP, as she will gain 15% healing bonus from her passive talent. Now do keep in mind from a quick demonstration on screen that a full HP build and a full EM build will both heal a relatively similar amount, with the HP build healing more, especially if you're running like a healing bonus circlet, although that typically isn't going to be the main thing you're looking for in a healer. As I've covered in many different videos, yes, healing a lot is good, but the reason why you choose a healer over another one is the other things that they bring to your team, and why, for example, Bennett is a lot more meta than someone like Chi-Chi, even if Chi-Chi's raw healing can be very high. With that said though, I want to finish talking about her talents because I'll get into more of why she's actually good in the next section, but lastly, there is actually her elemental burst, which is a nice bit of AoE electro damage when you press the ability. Your elemental burst creates a sort of electro field that does many hits of electro damage in very quick succession, and will actually do more hits if your Kuki's under 50% HP, so as we saw with her passive talent and with this ability, it is advantageous to keep her on low health, which the HP drain from your skill will actually help you do. Things to note about your burst is that the damage scales on your max HP, so an HP build will be dealing a okay amount of damage, although that's still typically not the main concern of this ability, as you're either building her elemental mastery for reactions, as we'll see later, or stacking HP for more healing. What is nice, however, is the electro application of this ability. The exact number of hits does depend on, first of all, if you're under 50% HP or not, and also weirdly enough, it can depend on your FPS, but you can typically get around 11 to 13 hits if you are under 50% HP. With that said, the way the electro application works is that it'll apply electro many times in a quick succession. You can get 5 electro applications throughout your burst very rapidly, which is especially going to be good in Dendro teams where you can either proc Aggravate many times, as we'll talk about in the next section, or proc Hyperbloom by hitting all the cores that your team will make by using Hydro and Dendro together, and then hitting them with your electro. Lastly, I did want to very quickly talk about Kuki's HP in general. A lot of people have concerns about, first of all, how to stay low HP, and also how to do that without dying. Well, the main thing with Kuki that you need to know is that when you use your skill, obviously you take damage, and then you'll start healing. But what you can do is what I did right there, where you can swap characters before it actually starts healing your Kuki, before the first tick of healing, which will allow your Kuki to stay on lower HP, and this is how you effectively lower it down to under 50%. Now with that said, let's actually get into the specifics surrounding Kuki and why Kuki got so much better with the release of the Dendro element, break down her different playstyles, and talk about why she's powerful. First of all, while Kuki's role has always been to be an electro healer who's both there to apply electro and heal your team, with the release of the Dendro element, the electro application that she gives cores becomes much more relevant. While her pure healer playstyle is one that existed before Dendro came out and is still one that I'm going to briefly cover in this video, the main difference is that now 2 new Kuki playstyles have been unlocked that are very good as they focus around these new Dendro reactions. The first one is Hyperbloom Kuki and the second one is Aggravate Kuki. The first playstyle revolves around the Hyperbloom reaction, where you're pairing Kuki with a Hydro and Dendro character who will bloom and create these Dendro cores on the field that Kuki will then proc with her off-field electro application through her elemental skill that constantly hits an AoE around her, proccing the blooms with ease. Since Hyperbloom is a transformative reaction, it will scale on your level and elemental mastery, meaning that an elemental mastery stacked Kuki will be doing tons of damage in this team. While she is on paper a support, in a Hyperbloom team she will actually be the carry and someone who's going to be doing a ton of electro damage by proccing this very powerful Hyperbloom reaction. For an Aggravate team, she's also going to be one of the characters in that team doing a lot of damage, as Aggravate is a reaction that buffs how much damage is being done by your electro attack when you use electro with Dendro, have a quicken aura on an enemy, and then use electro on it again. What's nice about Kuki in particular is that while her scalings aren't the highest things ever, her burst applies electro many times in very quick succession. In fact, it will apply electro 5 times back to back, and while sometimes having electro being applied so many times rapidly is not ideal, since Aggravate doesn't remove the quicken aura from an enemy, you'll actually be able to aggravate 5 times and just do a good amount of damage, as you can see from the footage being played on screen. With that said, if you want more information about how these new reactions actually work, I will link a video by Jeff77 who does a good job at explaining it, because I don't want to take up too much time with this video. The main things you need to know though are that Kuki's 2-in-1 healer and electro applier become much more valuable with the new Dendro reactions. To go into a bit more detail, my personal favorite team, where I believe Kuki is the most meta, is in Hyperbloom team comps. The reason why Kuki is so good is because her electro is AoE and has very little to no downtime with your second constellation from off field as just a quote-unquote supportive character. While other electros have more raw damage like Fischl or Beto, what they can struggle with is hitting the cores consistently, and also a character like Fischl is much more single target focused than someone like Kuki. While again, Fischl is an incredibly meta character, what Kuki lets you do is have a 2-in-1 healer and electro applier who does focus on having that AoE electro, being able to hit those cores every single time without fail, whereas some other electro characters will have some inconsistencies hitting them, like for example Beto's burst that doesn't bounce to the cores, and the same can be said with many electro characters. Because of that, Kuki is one of the premier options in a Hyperbloom team, especially if you need a healer, and is also quite good in Aggravate teams as well, as a healer and also an Aggravate damage dealer. For example, if you're already running Aggravate like Sino, you can have Kuki also aggravating, or have an Aggravate team built around Kuki, but more on that in the team comp section. And so that is why I do like Kuki with Dendro and why I think she got a lot better. And with that said, we are now going to move in to talking about Kuki's best builds for every type of playstyle. The way we're going to be doing this is splitting every section into pretty much 2. We're going to start with Hyperbloom and then talk about Aggravate for your artifacts, weapons, and all that. And then after that, I'll include a small section on how to build your Kuki as just a generic healer if that's all you care about. So I'll really be covering all the main ways you can play Kuki in this video. Alright, starting things off, let's talk about the artifact sets for a Hyperbloom Kuki. In general, the 4-piece Gilded Dreams is going to be your go-to because of the sheer amount of elemental mastery that it gives you. The 2-piece will give you 80, and then the 4-piece will give you up to 150. In fact, it gives you 50 elemental mastery for every party member that you have that's not electro. So typically in a Hyperbloom team that's going to be 150, but if you choose to run 2 electros, you'll still get 100 from it, and this will buff the damage of all of your Hyperblooms because of the way the Hyperbloom reaction works and synergizes with the set effect, to where this total of up to 230 elemental mastery from a 4-piece set, when you add the 2 and the 4-piece sets together, is going to be your best in slot and really good for Kuki overall. Also, since in a Hyperbloom team, elemental mastery is the main stat you're going to be focusing on, this set is obviously going to be not only your go-to, but also one that I believe is worth farming for, as once you have elemental mastery main stats, your substats will no longer be that important, so it should be relatively easy to at least get the 4-piece with usable main stats. With that said, other sets you can go for are obviously the 2-piece Gilded Dreams with the 2-piece Wanderers if you don't have a 4 Gilded Dreams, as you'll just get 160 elemental mastery, which isn't quite as much, but isn't bad if you have the substats for it. Now, before moving on, I do want to say you can run other sets like 4 Thundering Fury for a bit of Hyperbloom damage if you have better substats on it, and technically Millith can still be viable here, but we'll talk more about the set for other playstyles, as typically just stacking elemental mastery with the Gilded Dreams will be your best in slot. Before moving on though, for the artifact stats you want, as I said, elemental mastery is going to be your go-to, while energy recharge and like HP can be nice for a bit more damage and healing. For a Hyperbloom team specifically, since the Hyperbloom damage scales on your elemental mastery and your level, the large majority of your Kuki's damage is going to be coming from elemental mastery, so that is going to be the stat that you want the most by far on every substat on every piece. Because of that, you can go for EM on your Sands, Goblet, and Circlet, and look for it on your substats as your #1 priority. While energy recharge is nice for your burst and you can look for it on your substats, it's not as needed since you will be hyperblooming with your skill, so it's okay if for this playstyle you're not using your burst all the time off cooldown. Now moving on, for an Aggravate Kuki build, what are you looking looking for? Well, in this build, the sets that you're going for are more variable, as in there's a lot of good options depending on your substats and teams, and Gilded Dreams still remains to be a good choice because getting a ton of elemental mastery for your reaction damage and the damage of your kit as well, because of the passive talent that we saw earlier, is therefore one of the general go-to sets for this build, alongside a few others that are all similar in strength. First of all, the Thunder Soother can actually be your best in slot overall if your enemies that you're fighting are constantly affected by Electro. Do keep in mind, it is hard to maintain this Electro uptime on enemies, but if you can maintain it with multiple Electro characters, then the 35% damage increase you're getting is going to be the best overall. With that said, for more consistent options, as I said, you can go for Gilded Dreams or for 4-piece Emblem, increasing your burst damage and giving you energy recharge on the 2-piece, which is another very good option given how much energy recharge you need, which we'll talk about very shortly. And also the Thundering Fury 4-piece can also be good for Electro damage bonus and then also additional damage when you do proc Aggravate, which is what you're going to be going for. Because of that, all of those sets, as well as mix and matching 2-pieces of the sets we talked about, like Thundering Fury, Gilded Dreams, or even Noblesse Oblige, can all be viable options. Lastly, I do want to say that for a more supportive artifact set, even in a Gilded Dreams team, you can run, for example, Tenacity of the Millith, which yes, will make you deal less personal damage on Kuki, but since the 2-piece gives you HP % and the 4-piece buffs attack to your party members, if you're running other characters with high scalings, for example, Fischl or Sino, or a Dendro support that deals a lot of damage with potentially future Dendro supports coming out soon, Tenacity of the Millith can still be a good option on your Kuki, even in an offensive build, but typically I don't recommend it as much as like Gilded Dreams when you're looking to maximize your personal damage. With that said, we will talk more about these supportive artifact sets when we talk about the pure healer build in a smaller section a bit later in the video that I will have timestamps for. With the sets out of the way, what stats are you looking for on an Aggravate damage dealing Kuki? Well, first of all, I want to start by saying that your burst is a central part of this playstyle. You're going to be using your burst, as we saw earlier in the video, to actually proc Aggravate many times in quick succession and actually deal a good amount of burst damage. Your skill will also deal damage, but since you do actually want your burst, the first stat you're going to be looking for is energy recharge and making sure you have enough to spam your burst on cooldown. While the exact amounts vary heavily on the team you're running, generally though, I'd recommend running around 140 to 150 energy recharge if you're running another Electro support, and if not, you can go anywhere from 180 to 220. Once that's out of the way, you can start building for offensive stats on every single one of your pieces. The best stats are going to be crit rate and crit damage generally, as this not only will buff your Kuki's personal damage, because your abilities can crit, but it also buffs the Aggravate damage, as Aggravate is a reaction that can also crit, so you do double dip into this crit here, making it very good to buff your overall damage. Other than crit, Elemental Mastery and HP % are also very good, with Elemental Mastery typically being better than HP because of the passive talent that we saw earlier that gives you some EM scalings, meaning your elemental skill will actually deal some damage based on your EM, and then on top of that, if you do have your 6th Constellation, it becomes even better. But even without your 6th Constellation, Elemental Mastery not only buffs your damage a little bit, but will also buff your Aggravate damage, which is very important. While HP is still a good substat by all means, Elemental Mastery is typically going to be a bit better, especially when it comes down to like your sands. Because of that, for the specific main stats you're going for your sands, you either want energy recharge if you don't have enough. If not, you can go for an offensive sands like Elemental Mastery, or you can go for an HP % sands if your Elemental Mastery sands is not good enough and has much worse substats, although EM is typically going to be better and what I recommend. With that said, for your other pieces, you're going to be maximizing damage, as I said. So for your Goblet, you want Electro damage to get the most damage from your Kuki, and for your Circlet, you want to go for either crit rate or crit damage, whichever one you need more of, to balance your Kuki's ratio. Alright, moving on, let's now talk about Kuki's best weapons. First of all, for a Hyperbloom build, since you are stacking Elemental Mastery, and that is, as we saw, the main stat you're going for, that is also going to be true for your weapon options. Because of that, there's mainly going to be 3 sword options that you can go for, depending on which ones you have. First of all, the free-to-play option is going to be the Iron Sting, which is a great option because it gives you 165 Elemental Mastery, making it a good stat stick to increase your reaction damage and also give you a bit more healing through your passive talent. With that said, there are 2 swords that are going to be better: the Xiphos Moonlight, which is a new gacha 4-star that was featured on the last weapon banner, and the Freedom Sworn if you have it. While both of these weapons are more difficult to obtain because they come from the weapon banner, if you have them, they can be great options for Kuki. First of all, Xiphos Moonlight will give you the same Elemental Mastery as Iron Sting, but with just a better effect that gives energy recharge to every member of your party based on the Elemental Mastery that your Kuki will have, which just gives you more energy and is therefore good overall. The Freedom Sworn, on the other hand, gives you a bit more Elemental Mastery, 198, with an effect that increases your damage and will also buff your entire party members' normal charge and plunge attacks, as well as give them more attack %, which can be nice for your on-field DPS, like for example an Ayato or whoever else you may be using in a Hyperbloom team. Because of that, I would recommend using Freedom Sworn or Xiphos if you have either of them, and also depending on what your team needs, either damage or energy. But since both these weapons are weapon banner specific and they can be used for other characters, for example Kazuha, it's perfectly fine if you don't have them and if you just go for the Iron Sting, which you can craft at the blacksmith. With that said, I wouldn't really recommend any other options for an EM build. Like, yes, Alley Flash gives you a bit of EM, but it's not nearly as much, and yes, Favonia's Sword is an insane supportive option, but I wouldn't recommend recommended for an EM build since energy recharge isn't that needed on you, and you would also need to have enough crit rate on your substats to actually proc this passive. And if you do, then it can be viable, but in general, I would prefer stacking Elemental Mastery as that is very important for your Kuki. Moving on for an Aggravate Kuki, the weapons that you're going to be going for are those with offensive stats generally speaking. Because of that, your best options are going to be those like the Jade Cutter that gives you just a ton of crit rate. On top of that, the effect is even better on Kuki than on some other characters because your HP will be increased, which therefore will increase the damage of your burst as well, while also giving you a ton of crit rate. With that said, other crit 5-star weapons like the Mistsplitter or the Huron can also be very good 5-star options. The Freedom Sword is also one of your best weapons, despite it being a supportive weapon, because it gives you a ton of elemental mastery, which again increases your Kuki's personal damage, both in a Hyperbloom and in an Aggravate team, while also buffing every other character you're running through its effect, making it a good option overall. Lastly, for the 5 stars, the new Key Sword that gives you HP and elemental mastery from the effect if you can stack it is also good for Kuki. The main problem being that you need to stack it, which happens when you're on field, so you might have to spend more time on your Kuki, and so it's not my favorite weapon overall, but it is still a good one for this build if you do have it. With that said, for the 4-star options, again, most offensive ones are okay, but my favorites include, first of all, the Iron Sting as your free-to-play option. You can craft this at the blacksmith and just get elemental mastery and elemental damage bonus, which is very good. Or an alternative free-to-play weapon is the Sapwood Blade for energy recharge, helping you spam your burst without needing as much energy recharge in your artifacts, while also increasing your elemental mastery when you pick up the leaf that spawns on the ground. Zyphos Moonlight is also good for the same reasons I mentioned in the Hyperbloom section, just a ton of EM and giving you energy. And the Festering Desire can also be a really good free-to-play option if you still have this. It was a limited time weapon from many patches ago, but if you have it, increasing your skill damage and giving you energy recharge typically makes this the best of the free-to-play options. With that said, this playstyle is flexible. You can still go for supportive weapons like Favonius or any weapon with a crit stat, but in general, the weapons that I mentioned like Iron Sting, Festering Desire, or any of the 5 stars like Jade Cutter or Freedom Thorn are what I would prefer for an offensive Aggravate Kuki build. With all that said, if you want to play Kuki as just a pure healer build, well, I don't recommend this as you'll get a lot less damage and stuff, but if you want to use her in like a non-Dendro team, you still can, and in that case, I'd recommend a supportive artifact set like Tenacity the Millith, generally speaking, but if not, you can also go 4-piece Noblesse Oblige, or if you want to run this build in a Dendro team, you can go for 4-piece Deepwood, as it will buff your team from off field, but Millith is generally what I recommend. For your weapon, a supportive option like Favonius Sword is typically your go-to, with Freedom Sword also being an amazing option, and also Zyphos Moonlight being good as well. And I did want to mention Sapwood Blade briefly if you're proccing Dendro reactions, just for the elemental mastery that I can buff one of your characters with, but in general, Favonius is going to be better. Lastly, for this build, the stats you're going to be looking for are HP, just to maximize your healing, so HP on the sands, HP on your goblet, and then for your circlet, while you can go HP, healing bonus is typically going to be better to give you as much healing as possible. Alright, now next up, let's quickly talk about Kuki's Constellations and the value of each of them. Now I want to start by saying that Kuki's Constellations as a whole, while a few of them are quite nice, are mainly there to just give you some quality of life changes and a bit more utility, making some of them good but not needed, and it's not like her playstyles are locked behind certain constellations. With that said, her first constellation is quite nice if you are playing Hyperbloom or are relying on using her burst, as it will increase its AoE significantly by 50%, which makes it a lot more consistent at hitting enemies all around you, especially in, as I said, a Hyperbloom team. Moving on, her second constellation is probably my favorite overall. It's one of the very useful ones in pretty much every team. They'll increase the duration of your skill by 3 seconds, giving it 100% uptime. In fact, it'll now last for 15 seconds total on a 15-second cooldown, which will give you another 3 seconds of healing, dealing damage, and applying electro, and giving your skill, as I said, no downtime, which is very nice when compared to, for example, Dory, who has like 8 seconds downtime on her burst. Moving on, your third and fifth constellation increase your talent levels, and your fourth constellation is going to be the biggest increase to your Kuki's personal damage if you are on an electro damage based build. What this constellation does is give you an extra hit of AoE electro damage that scales on your Kuki's HP whenever your active character is attacking, either normal, charge, or plunge attacks, while your Kuki's skill is active. This can trigger once every 5 seconds and will therefore just give you more electro application and more damage passively from off field, making it a quite nice constellation. Lastly, your sixth constellation is a pretty unique one, and it is one that has 2 parts to it. The first part of this constellation is that when you are about to take lethal damage, your Kuki doesn't actually die and will instead live with 1 HP, and this can trigger every 60 seconds. This is going to be an okay way to keep your Kuki at low HP to proc her passives, as well as the second part of this constellation that will give you a bonus 150 elemental mastery for 15 seconds when your Kuki's HP drops under 25%. Because of that, when you're using your skill or taking damage and you get under that 25% HP threshold, you'll get a pretty relevant increase in damage, as elemental mastery is going to be very good in reaction based teams, as well as the bonus scalings that it does give to Kuki. With that said, the uptime on this isn't that high, and it's not the easiest constellation to proc, but 150 elemental mastery as well as preventing you from dying can be quite nice. Overall, Kuki's constellations are pretty good but not needed, especially when you look at like the convenience that C1 and C2 gives you. They are just nice to have, but not something you should feel forced to go for. Alright, now with all of that out of the way, let's talk about how to to build your Kuki teams. First of all, let's start by talking about Hyperbloom Kuki. For a Hyperbloom Kuki team, it's pretty straightforward. You're going to want a Hydro character, a Dendro character, and your Kuki to constantly proc the Hyperbloom. Your last character will be a flex option, and through all of these slots, there's going to be many different characters that are viable, so let's break down the best options for each element. First of all, for your Dendro support in this team, right now there's only really two characters that you can use as an off-field Dendro applier, which is either the main character or Kole, both of which are actually viable here, although generally speaking, the main character is going to be better, as they just apply more Dendro with their burst, and also deal pretty good damage. With that said, Kole can be okay, especially if you have the elegy for the end bow, and her burst cooldown is only 15 seconds, but in general, the Dendro MC is the best option. But with that said, I suspect there will also be better Dendro characters that will come out like Nahida, who you could also use in this team comp. I also wanted to add that regarding Tsikhnari, he isn't really an off-field Dendro support, so if you do choose to use him for Hyperloom, you do have to play it around your Tsikhnari and spend a lot of time on him with a more off-field Hydro support option, and I personally don't recommend it as much as just running the Dendro main character, but it is something that is viable if you want to try it. Moving on for your Hydro option, well, pretty much every Hydro character, or at least every offensive Hydro character can work here. I do want to say that Ayato is my personal favorite, as he will be your on-field Hydro applier, your on-field auto attacker in this team, whereas some other team comps can kind of struggle to figure out who's going to be your on-field carry. Because of that, I really like running an Ayato Hyperbloom team with Kuki, as Ayato will be that character on-field, constantly applying Hydro, while your Kuki Hyperblooms from off-field. On top of that, his Hydro damage is AoE, which means that he's going to be a very good option against many enemies. With that said, there's obviously other good Hydros like Yelan or Xingqiu who can work very well in this team as well. And I also wanted to mention that while I haven't tested it personally, you can run some teams with Candace on a 15-second rotation with Kole as well, because their cooldowns do line up, and so does Kuki's elemental skill, but that typically isn't going to be my main recommendation. Lastly, regarding Child, he can work, but does have a lot of downtime, and so you won't be as efficient on field as Ayato will. And regarding Kokomi, if you're going to use her, I wouldn't recommend using Kuki in that team. I'd use probably another Electro, as at that point you're running two healers, so typically I wouldn't recommend it as much as the other offensive options that I mentioned, with Ayato being my personal favorite. Lastly, for the flex option in this team, it is obviously going to be very flexible, but you typically just want an offensive option that will help you deal more damage passively as you are proccing Hyperloom. Kazuo can be a great example of this, as he can swirl both Hydro and Electro for you, as well as group up enemies very easily. On top of that, his damage is good, and while he may steal some Hyperblooms from your Kuki, that isn't a problem as he is stacking full elemental mastery. In fact, regarding this stealing Hyperbloom, that is something else that you want to keep in mind. For example, some Electro characters you can run alongside your Kuki can actually steal some of your Hyperblooms, meaning that the other Electro character you're running, typically on a crit and attack percent focus build, is going to be proccing the reaction with low elemental mastery, therefore making you do a lot less damage than if your full EM build character like Kuki is going to be proccing it. That's why a Hyperbloom team typically wants Kuki as the character proccing the reactions, but if you have another character like Kazuo or Sucrose who is typically stacking EM anyways, it's not that big of a deal if they proc it instead. So because of that, they can be good options. Other options include Electro supports like Fischl, who's just very good overall, or Beidou, who's one of the best options in this team, as she gives you a ton of Electro damage from off field that bounces between enemies, and that will also not steal your Hyperblooms because it can't bounce to the Dendro cores. Lastly, I did want to mention that Albedo can work to buff elemental mastery and give you a bit of passive damage through his elemental skill, as well as run a supportive artifact set. Now moving on, for a Kuki Aggravate team, here you're going to be using Electro and Dendro to proc your core reaction, and then you're typically going to run a second Electro character as well as an Anemo support or another offensive option as your last slot. Because of that, what teams look like are one of two things. Either you run Kuki as a very powerful off-field Aggravate support and also healer with another Electro carry like Sino or Kaching, both characters obviously being very viable and good DPSs for this team, where you can run Kuki as your healer option. Now with that said, if you don't want to run these main DPS Electro characters, you can run some supportive ones like generic Electro supports. Fischl, Yai Miko, Beidou, or literally even someone like Lisa can all work as just Electro supports in an Aggravate team, as you will be greatly buffing your Electro damage. Speaking of which, I do recommend running an Anemo support like Kazuo or Sucrose in this team, who will have the Verdescent Veneer set, as well as buffs, Kazuo giving you elemental damage bonus and Sucrose giving you elemental mastery, which will make your Electro damage way stronger. As remember, all of these buffs will actually affect not only the damage of your abilities that you're using, like your skill, burst, and attacks that are Electro, but also of your Aggravate itself, since the reaction does scale with elemental mastery and like your elemental damage. Once again, this team, you're going to be looking for the same Dendro options as I mentioned in a Hyperbloom team. The only change is that you can run Tsikhnari as a more on-field carry in this team, as you can proc both Aggravate and Spread if you're running Tsikhnari with Electro supports, so that is something to do if you want to play this character. Now lastly, before moving on, I wanted to very quickly say that if you want to run Kuki as just a generic support, you can do so in many different teams where you just want Electro and also a healer as a 2-in-1. In general, this would be with someone like Eula, where she can be your Electro support who will proc Superconduct, allowing you to run cryo characters in the other slots instead of needing more electro. There's also other generic teams you can run Kuki in, like Ito teams, where Kuki will give you reactions and a healer, or some electro charge variations, but typically as just a generic support without Dendro, she's not usually the best option as she wasn't really meta before Dendro came out, but I do like her, for example, in Eula teams, so it is something I wanted to mention as a viable option. But the main focus of this video was the new Dendro teams for Kuki, where she's actually really good, like Aggravate and especially Hyperbloom. And so because of that, I'm now going to include a Hyperbloom Kuki showcase where you guys get to see this team in action in the current floor 12. Do keep in mind this is a team showcase, so there's also good damage from Ayato and Kazuha, but it will be focused on Kuki's Hyperbloom on a generic Iron Sting 4 Gilded Dreams full elemental mastery build. I'll try to make this showcase kind of short because the video is getting long. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed the guide and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go.
This is getting interesting.
Germinate! Scatter!
Falling leaves. Adorn! Mind damage. Wind strike.
Clouds high. The bird.
Kamisato Suyu.
Again.
Into the wind. As one with wind and cloud.
Out of my way.
One with nature.
So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This really was a longer guide than usual, so definitely give me feedback on what you think because I really tried to include everything you need to know about Kuki. Initially, this was going to be a video focused on Hyperbloom, but then I just thought I might as well include Aggravate and also just a standard healer build, so I might as well just make the video more detailed, and I really hope you guys appreciated that and enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe as it means a lot. Let me know what you think about the new editing style as well, if it's better or worse, and expect a ton of new videos and guides soon. With all that out of the way, I hope you enjoyed this guide, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.